During the 2021 season, Oregon's Kayvon Thibodeaux was viewed as the consensus number one overall pick in the 2022 NFL Draft. But since the season has ended, his stock has fallen. Could he be there for the Jets at 4, and would he be a good fit? We'll talk about this on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, April 1st, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit that subscribe button, and you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, today we have a Prospect Friday show. On Fridays during the offseason, I have tried to profile a prospect who could interest the Jets with one of their first-round picks every week. We stopped a little bit for free agency, but we started up again last week. And today we're going to turn our attention to the defensive side of the ball because most of our Prospect Friday shows have been at the wide receiver position. But there are some needs for the Jets on defense. They had arguably the worst defense in the NFL last year. And the guy we're going to talk about today is Kayvon Thibodeaux of Oregon. A very interesting prospect because through most of the 2021 season, he was viewed as the consensus number one overall pick in this upcoming draft. In fact, it's kind of funny that we're sitting here on April 1st talking about him as potentially the fourth pick, and I've even heard some rumors, you read some mock drafts that have him falling all the way to 10, where the Jets have their second first-round pick. And the reason that's funny is because I recall a lot of Jets fans being distraught around Christmas when they beat the Jacksonville Jaguars in a late-season game, and people thought that was going to cost them Thibodeaux. And now there are lots of those same fans are sitting there saying, like, you cannot draft this guy at 4, you cannot draft this guy at 10. It's funny how things change. And that's one of the reasons you talk in season where I'm typically against the idea of tanking. It's a perfect example because a couple months ago, people were talking about how it was the end of the world. The Jets weren't going to be able to get this guy. Now a lot of the same people don't even want him. But we're going to talk about Thibodeaux, whether he could be a good fit, what he does well, some of the things he maybe doesn't do so well. That's going to be the focus of today's show. And on these Prospect Friday shows, I always try and begin on a good note, and we talk about what the player can do effectively. And for Thibodeaux, there's a lot. I mean, I think that if you watch the way he played at Oregon, this is kind of like your prototypical top pass rushing prospect. This is the type of guy who just seems like the complete package on paper. I mean, he's got a really explosive first step, and he's explosive. He can accelerate off the edge. He's just a tough guy because he's got that speed. He fires off the snap. So that makes him a difficult matchup for opposing tackles. But there's more to it. He does what I call pass rushing with a plan. And that's essentially he tries to set blockers up, whether it's a tackle. Sometimes he'll slide inside the guard. He did at Oregon, where he's either trying to force the guy inside. His initial move's inside so that he can burst outside, or his initial rush is outside so that way he can make a move inside. This is not a guy who just flies, and that's something you see in a lot of prospects is they're just trying to fly upfield. You just try and win with speed purely. And Thibodeaux does try to win with speed, but he also approaches his pass rushing attempts as though he's got a plan. Like he's trying to set the pass rush, the blocker up. And that's something that, again, that's one of the reasons I think he's regarded so highly, or at least was regarded so highly before the end of the season, because he's not the most polished pass rusher out there, but he's more polished than a lot of guys are coming out of college. He understands what he's going to try and attack an opposing offensive lineman with, and he does it very well. And I think he's got strong hands. I think that's another thing. He's got decent length. He's got strong hands where he knows how to hand fight. He knows how to get off blocks. And he doesn't have the most refined set of pass rushing moves out there, but I've seen signs of a rip where that's essentially where you use your arm and you essentially rip the offensive lineman, rip the blocker's arm away from you. So he does have one counter move that I've seen him use extensively, and a counter move is essentially if Plan A doesn't work, if your first move, I mentioned your first plan doesn't work and you end up being engaged, how do you disengage from an offensive lineman? And he's got the rip, and he can develop more, but he's entering the NFL with at least one move that I've been able to see him use effectively as a counter move. I also think he's not that bad against the run. I've seen some criticism of him against the run, and I have to say, when I slow things down, I try and figure out what everybody's assignment is, because there are times where a running back may go right past you and it looks like you messed up, but sometimes that's not your assignment. Sometimes it's because somebody else blew his assignment. And within the structure of a given play, you have to execute your job. You can't do somebody else's job, because if you're trying to do somebody else's job, then your responsibility is going to be left vacant, and the other team could exploit that. So even against the run, sometimes where I think it looks on film like maybe he didn't do very well, more often he's doing his job. He's tying up the guy. He's filling the gap he's supposed to fill. And run defense is mainly about the gap that you're responsible for, or multiple gaps you're responsible for. And the gap is essentially the area between two blockers, whether it's a center and a guard and a tackle, or a tackle and a tight end, or the edge area where your job's to set the edge. Thibodeaux does his job, and I think he does it pretty effectively. And I think he's got good strength for a guy of his size. I think he plays pretty effectively. And what's the other thing that's interesting is when people are concerned about a prospect who's very talented, who has the gifts, I'm talking about the athletic tools, which I've been referencing. Many times there's a question about, does he play hard all the time? And Thibodeaux has a great motor, in my opinion. I mean, you see him cover a lot of ground. You'll see him make tackles when he wasn't really supposed to be anywhere near the play, where he just kind of follows the ball and gets there. And that's different. I know I just mentioned, you're not supposed to do other people's jobs, but that's the instances I'm talking about are after his area is secure and there's no further danger to his area. That's when he goes and gets the ball. Less importantly, I mean, he's got experience dropping into coverage again. I think he's shown this is not going to be his forte. I mean, I don't think you're going to draft Kayvon Thibodeaux high in the first round just to drop him into coverage, but he does have experience dropping into coverage. And another thing this is something that doesn't show up in the stat sheet, but it's one thing that I've noticed. And sometimes you have to read between the lines when you're evaluating prospects. He was the focal point of a lot of opponent game plans last year at Oregon. And that means, sometimes he's seeing double teams a lot. Sometimes they're just trying to go away from him. These are things that you see frequently. You saw frequently last year with Thibodeaux. And so you can't always box score scout, and he was still pretty productive on the box scores, but sometimes you have to watch what the other team's doing, how the other team's trying to neutralize him. And there were plenty of cases, and it's always a little tricky because when you're evaluating a big-time prospect, he's not going up against the level of competition he'll see in the NFL. So you have to figure out ways to contextualize these things. And one thing I noticed with Thibodeaux is frequently, especially when they moved him inside, I mean, Thibodeaux against most college guards can be a complete mismatch. And he just dominated them when he moved inside. I mean, it was he completely manhandled those guys unless he got double teamed. And essentially that's what you're looking for. That's what I'm looking for when you contextualize these things. It's not always, yes, it's about sacks. Yes, it's about how productive you are. Production does matter, but it's also about how do you perform in your matchups. And there were many times where the other team just felt the need to double team him. The other team felt the need to get away from him, to run their offense outside of his direction. And that's something that shows you the respect he had among Pac-12 offensive coordinators, where they did not want this guy to destroy their game. And it felt to me like they were kind of altering their plans to avoid going after Thibodeaux. So I think that, you look at this guy, this is probably as close to a complete package, at least on paper, as you'll find as a pass rusher entering the NFL. And, it doesn't always mean that the guy's going to be as successful in the NFL. And there's always the questions about adjusting to the pro game. There's questions about how he'll do against better competition. But you look at what he did in college. You look at the way he was respected by opposing coordinators. You look at the raw tools. There's an awful lot to like about this guy. And to be honest with you, I can't think of many criticisms of him. But ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, because we talk about things guys can do and guys can't do, I'll give you some of the question marks that may exist about Thibodeaux. I have to be honest with you, I don't think there are many, but we'll talk about those ahead here on this Friday episode of Locked On Jets. Of course, our focus here on Locked On Jets is football, but the big news in sports this weekend is the Final Four. You've got North Carolina and Duke. You've got Kansas and Villanova. college basketball has determined its top teams, and the national champion will be crowned Monday night after the semifinals on Saturday. And BetOnline is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it, BetOnline is the best spot for all your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all the leagues this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. And even though we're in the NFL offseason, you can still wager on the NFL. There are Super Bowl odds out there. Jets not very good. BetOnline has them at about 200 to 1 odds right now, actually a little bit worse than we began the offseason. So if you really believe in what Joe Douglas is doing, you can make some money using BetOnline. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day, and make sure you're following Locked On NFL. Locked On experts covering the biggest stories around the NFL every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are talking about Kayvon Thibodeaux, the top prospect pass rusher out of Oregon, probably a defensive end in the Jets scheme. In the first segment, I talked about all the things he brings to the table. In the second segment of these prospect shows, I usually talk about the things the guy doesn't do so well. I don't have a lot for you there. I think I think his bend is a little bit overrated. When he's going off the edge, how far he can get down. I don't think it's bad. I mean, I don't think it's bad for a guy of his size at his position. I think I've heard people talk about his elite bend. I think maybe that's a little overrated. So that's one thing. Another thing I've noticed is that he does struggle a bit when he's the unblocked guy on the line. Now, sometimes you'll see in both college and the NFL, you will intentionally leave a defender unblocked. And if it doesn't work, you get criticized because you go, how could you leave this guy unblocked? If the guy makes the play, you're like, what kind of stupid play call is this essentially, you have to think this one through in the NFL or in college as well. You have 11 offensive players. You have 11 defensive players. On offense, somebody's always going to have the ball. So that means you have 10 guys to block 11 players on defense. And more often than not, unless you have a mobile quarterback, your quarterback's not really going to be in the mix. So it's really kind of 9 on 11, 9 blockers versus 11 defenders. So sometimes you leave a guy unblocked. You're essentially trying to use him as the fake guy. You're trying to fake him out, make him run the wrong direction. And again, when it doesn't work, you get criticized until the end of time because you're like, well, what kind of an, especially when it happens with somebody like Thibodeaux, where it's, how could you not block this guy? Well, it's part of the plan. He's kind of the guy you're optioning off of. You're trying to build in a play that will either make him go in the wrong direction, or you're essentially trying to either have it built in an option where you put the ball in the opposite of the direction he's going. I don't think he's that great on those plays. I think sometimes he gets lost a little bit. I think he struggles in situations like that. Sometimes he'll overrun the play in those situations. But if we're talking film, I mean, I think that there are very few areas where I'd say that this guy is weak. I think overall, and again, like, you can't ever guarantee a guy's going to be great in the NFL. There's a lot of that goes into it that goes beyond college production and physical tools, but this is about as good as you can get as far as, I'm not saying maybe he's not like the greatest prospect, maybe he's not, I hate the term generational, but it's very difficult for me to find many holes in Kayvon Thibodeaux's game. Now, I know there are going to be questions about the process. There's always the draft process where you're going through the drills and you're meeting with teams. And it does seem like this has not been a great process for Thibodeaux, because he's gone from a guy who, through most of the season, was pretty much the lock to be the number one pick. I mean, that's this year he was the guy people were saying teams were tanking for, which I don't really believe, but he was that guy. He was like, well, we're going to tank for Thibodeaux. And then, late in the year, Aiden Hutchinson of Michigan kind of emerged. So it was like, okay, Thibodeaux, Hutchinson, 1-2. And as we've gotten deeper into the offseason, deeper into this process, Thibodeaux's kind of fallen down the boards, and that's led to some speculation about, is he not doing well through this whole process when he's meeting with teams? What concerns do teams have? And listen, I don't have any of that information. And listen, I try and tell you the things that I know, but I don't want to make stuff up when I don't know it. I don't think that it's really that helpful for me to make wild guesses as to what's happening in this process. And that's partially because this process can get very difficult to break down. Every year there are players who fall during the pre-draft process for whatever reason. And sometimes we learn, as with Ja'Kai Polite a few years ago with the Jets, sometimes we learn that there are very legitimate reasons that this player is falling. Sometimes, however, we learn that the reasons that they're falling, turn out to not be so legitimate. A guy who comes to mind over a decade ago was Justin Houston, who put together a great career, mostly with the Chiefs. He played a little bit with the Colts as well. This was a guy who was Justin Houston was a guy who in 2011 was viewed as a first-round talent, and then for whatever reason, I don't know exactly what happened, but he had this horrible process pre-draft and fell all the way to the third round, and the Chiefs ended up getting a great pass rusher, a guy who for a couple of years was one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. And there are plenty of examples like this, and to be honest with you, some of it's subjective. What worries one team may not worry another team. I don't really know what's going on with Thibodeaux, so I don't want to. On this podcast, I never want to tell you things that where I would just be purely guessing. Now, listen, I'm guessing about how Thibodeaux's game's going to translate to the NFL, but I'm trying to go based on what we know, what he's put on the film in college. But as far as this goes, I don't think I would be doing you service to determine whether or not there are reasons he should be dropping down the board. So I'm not going to guess. That's just, if you want somebody who's going to guess, there are plenty of other podcasts out there, but I never want to speculate on something where I would just be guessing and I'd be pretending that I know something that I simply do not. So if there are reasons he's falling down the board, that's up to the Jets to figure out. And that's, that's part of scouting. If there aren't, then the Jets should grab the guy because, again, the film looks really good. Now, how would Thibodeaux fit the Jets? That's the question we will answer as we close out this show. That's how we always close out these Prospect Friday shows. I tell you where I think the guy would fit in if the Jets were to draft him. And we'll finish the show by talking about how Kayvon Thibodeaux could fit the Jets if they draft him at 4, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast. Of course, whoever the Jets draft at 4 and at 10 will receive a lucrative rookie contract. It'll give them plenty of money to buy Built Bars if they want, because Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar on the market. It may be a protein bar, but it doesn't taste like one. All bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. At Built Bar, they make it taste delicious first, then they figure out how to make it healthy. And I don't know how they do it, but they pull it off every time, because you got flavors like mint brownie, coconut almond, and white chocolate cookies and cream. These bars are delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. If they think a flavor might be good, they'll make it. It'll be delicious and good for you. Most bars have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. So go to Built.com right now. You can check out the selection. You can check out all the different flavors that are available to you. And if you decide you like one of them and want to buy it, use promo code LOCKED15. If you use that code, I'll get you 15% off. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15. It's one word with no space, LOCKED, number 1, number 5, for 15% off at Built, BUILT.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We are talking about Oregon's Kayvon Thibodeaux, a prospect for the Jets who could be there at 4. Increasingly, it seems like he will be there at 4. And now there are even some rumors he may fall all the way to 10, which would be surprising. It wouldn't be the most surprising thing I've ever seen, but based on where we were during the season, it would be kind of surprising. So would Kayvon Thibodeaux fit the Jets? And I think the answer is yes. And listen, the other day, Robert Saleh told you, I don't care if I have the fearsome foursome. I'm always looking at it as a pass rusher. This is the type of defense, and we've seen philosophically during Saleh's time with the Jets have kind of tried to build this defense through the line. And, of course, they've signed Carl Lawson last season, but even if Carl Lawson had stayed healthy last year, it still felt like they needed that other guy, that guy across from the bookend pass rusher. And Thibodeaux could be that guy. You get Thibodeaux on passing down, suddenly you've got Lawson and Thibodeaux on the outside at end. And on the inside, you got Quinnen Williams, and you're sliding John Franklin Myers in there. I mean, that's the kind of pass rush I like. That's the kind of pass rush you could start to build something with. On early downs, it would be interesting. I'm always very hesitant to expect too much out of rookies, and the Jets have gone small. Last year, the Jets went really small in the back of their defense, smaller linebackers. They were trying not to ask as much as their corners. They wanted their linebackers to cover a lot of ground. So they kind of had John Franklin Myers as a power defensive end. And I wonder whether they may want to stick with that. Because if you're going small at the back of your defense, that means you probably want to compensate that for being bigger at the front. So maybe you'd have a situation where you'd have Thibodeaux rotate in. Maybe he wouldn't be a completely full-time player, but maybe something more along the lines of like 60% of the snaps. Passing downs, he comes in and Franklin Myers kicks inside. that's kind of the direction I feel like the Jets are going in. Of course, you draft a guy 4 overall. There's a not small chance he's just going to be a full-time player, and you'll have Lawson and Thibodeaux getting after the quarterback full-time, and then when somebody needs a rest, they step out. But pretty easy to see where he fits in with this team. Again, Robert Saleh always going to want to add an extra pass rusher. He said it himself. There is a case to be made. Thibodeaux might be better in like a stand-up type of role, but I've always felt like that's a little bit overstated. I always felt like the difference between that and today's NFL, between a guy who stands up as kind of an outside linebacker, pass rushing outside linebacker, versus a guy with his hand in the dirt as a defensive end. I always feel like that might be. This is not as big of a deal as it was maybe 20 years ago when there was a clear delineation between a 4-3 type defense and a 3-4 type defense. Almost every team's using some elements of 4-3 and some elements of 3-4. And honestly, the biggest difference, if a guy's comfortable standing up, you just have him stand up. If he's comfortable with his hand in the ground, you have him put his hand in the ground. You could give him essentially the same roles. These defenses in the NFL are not as distinct as they used to be. So I don't see that as big of a deal, even though there are some people out there who think maybe he'd be a little bit better because he's not he'd be a little smaller than optimal as a 4-3 defensive end or 4-3 type defensive end, but I don't see that as the end of the world. And listen, pass rushing, the ability to get after the quarterback is something that's very important in today's NFL, and I think you make exceptions for guys who can do it very effectively. And Kayvon Thibodeaux is a guy who projects to be able to do that very effectively. Again, I will never guarantee you a guy's going to be a great player, because there's so much that goes into it, but I look at the odds of this guy being a good player, they're probably higher than you'd say about most players. So he's got the chance to be a really terrific NFL player as a pass rusher off the edge. Anyway, that's all for our show today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoy the show, subscribe to it. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a thumbs up. It helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back next week to talk more Jets.